Woohoo!
Good.
We're good.
Okay. Hey everyone, welcome back to Quality Matters. I'm your hostess, Darcy Chambers. I'm here with my co-host,
Kyle Chambers.
and we have another special guest. Well, not another, a repeat guest. Chris Paris is back with us. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Why the confused look?
Well, I mean, usually I'm thrown out after the first one, not invited back.
That was a lot of fun.
Onward and upward.
All right, so we were briefly discussing what we're going to talk about tonight.
Yeah.
Which is the conflict of interest in the ISO standards development.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, I think I'm gonna let y'all go ahead. Now, I will say when we discussed this over email just a little bit. What we're going to talk about tonight. And when I told Kyle about it, I said, "Well, that's interesting because I think we just recently did an episode where we talked about we thought the way they developed the standards was a good way they did it."
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So we thought it would be an interesting topic for y'all to discuss.
Sure. I'll debunk that.
Okay, go ahead.
Let's go. So, I guess part of what I've run into, and I see good and bad points to this both ways, is folks get very frustrated by the overly vagueness, especially with the 2015 edition of the standard.
Right.
That's just overly got a fun comment on LinkedIn just over our last podcast, kind of in reference to that. And I get that, but at the same time, it makes it a lot more fun for me as a consultant because I can come in and devise really almost any solution that works for the company.
Right.
But I don't think most people go that way. I think most people like it to be do this, do this, do this. I met it, there's my checklist, and I'm done.
Right.
What's your thoughts?
So, well, that's a good thing. I mean, first point number one is that the vagueness and confusion in ISO 9000, the 2015, is intentional. Understand that, and I'll explain that in a minute. But it is interesting that you take the position that you can use that confusion to your advantage, and most people don't understand that.
Right.
So that's why I always say there's a happy ending. I'm going to talk and say all these terrible things, but there is a happy ending. The standard is terrible. The new standard is worse. It's very hard to understand. It's confusing. This is intentional. But at the end of the day, you can use that to your advantage because you have a wider range of things you can do to satisfy. There's still some limitations, but you have to understand it, and it's almost become impossible, if not impossible now, to implement ISO 9000 without using some third-party help, which was not true when the standard came out in '87.
So when you say you can use it to your advantage, you're referring to the companies that are using the ISO standard.
Not me.
Okay, because the comment that he got, right? Well, that's what the comment that he got was kind of referencing, saying how convenient is it for all these consultants that it's vague and confusing. So I think he was kind of saying it's used to the consultant's advantage.
That is when I say this is intentional. That is why it's intentional.
Okay.
This is absolutely intentional.
Okay.
And I'll explain that. So the first thing I wanted to say is that first, we think that ISO develops standards, right? We call ISO a standards development body. They're not. They do not develop standards. Okay. And I should have worn a poncho because you're going to explode. This is going to be a mess, right? Because I'm about to blow your mind. Right?
Okay.
ISO does not develop standards. ISO is a publishing company.
Right.
That's all they do. They publish books. But the books that they publish, they happen to call standards. They could call them avocados. That would not make them an avocado grower.
Right.
They're a book publishing company. They just happen to call them standards. And we know this. This is easy. This is not conspiracy theory, right? ISO is required to publish their annual report every year, which includes their balance sheet, their financials. ISO only has three sources of income. The first is the sale of books. And then the other two I'll talk in a minute, but it has to do with licensing and everything. And they only have three, I don't forget how many, a couple bills that they have to pay, expenses. None of them are related to standards development. ISO spends $0 on standards development. So they get money from publishing books and they spend $0 on development of standards. That means they're not a standards developer. So how do they develop standards? And it's really, really weird. And I talk about this in my book, Surviving ISO 9000. Available at survivingiso9001.com.
We'll leave a link.
Yeah, I forgot to do that last time. And I explain this. But what they do is bizarre. ISO is what's called a vanity press. So in the publishing world, if you write a book, You then present that book to the publisher, and the publisher says, I'm going to publish that. I'm going to give you an advance. I'm going to give you some money, maybe $20,000, $30,000, and then you're going to get a percentage of the sales. So you're getting paid by the publisher. In the ISO world, the authors, people on the technical committee that write it, they go to ISO and they say, here's our book, right? And ISO says, okay, thank you very much, and they keep it and sell it, right? And the authors don't get anything. So that only appeals to people who want to get published. Now in the publishing world, like if you write a terrible book, it's really bad, and you try to publish it, and the publishers say we don't want anything to do with it, you can then go to what's called a vanity press, and they'll publish it, but you have to pay them. And that's the model that ISO works from, right? Which is very, very strange. So how are ISO standards written? The technical committees, and we have one in the United States, right? Let's say ISO decides tomorrow, we're going to make a new standard on invisibility. We need to standardize invisibility, right? So they put out a call saying, hey, all the countries of the world, send us your volunteers. Right? So all these volunteers get together and they write the standard for visibility, and they're basically putting their intellectual property on paper. They then give that intellectual property to ISO, and ISO keeps it forever.
Right.
It says, thank you very much. You can't have that back. You wrote it, but it's mine now.
Okay.
Right.
So
but there are benefits that they get to have their name on it, or some reference.
That's the vanity aspect
Gotcha.
of it, right? But it's even worse than that. So in order for them to do that, the countries have to actually pay ISO a fee, right? So ANSI pays ISO a membership fee for the privilege of gathering up volunteers who will surrender their intellectual property to ISO for free. So it's not even for free.
Interesting.
We pay for it. So imagine that like you had a soup kitchen, right? And you want to volunteer at the soup kitchen. So you go to the soup kitchen, you volunteer, and the soup kitchen says, this is great, awesome, we love it. We're making soup for the homeless people, but we're going to charge you $1,000 to volunteer. And you're like, oh, I thought I was just working for free.
Right.
I'm actually working at a loss. So, okay,
Right.
here's my $1,000, now I'm going to make soup. And then when you're done with the soup, you say, hey, I'm hungry, can I have some soup? And they say, no, you can't have soup, you can buy it. And then, like as you're walking out the door, you notice that they're not actually giving the soup to the homeless, they're charging the homeless $3,000 per cup. ISO gets revenue from all three of those, right? They get revenue from the standards bodies of the nations, the national bodies, pay them for the privilege of having their members give this intellectual property. They then sell that, and then they license it back. So if ANSI, our national body in the United States, wants to republish ISO, they got to pay another fee. And those are the three sources of income that ISO has. So that's what sort of debunks this whole thing, is like the guys on the committee who write the standard are supposed to be business management experts, but they don't know that like when you do work, you're supposed to get paid. You don't pay your boss. You don't pay your boss for the privilege of working.
Clearly, they've never started a small business.
Yeah, you'd have to never even been an employee.
Right.
Because they don't know how. So it's astonishing that anybody would sign
Well,
up for
I
this.
appreciated. Well, I guess I didn't really understand that ISO was not a standards developer and was just a publisher.
Yeah.
So the way I understood it was that they were reaching out and getting input from people in the field. So I thought, oh, well, that's.
Right.
I liked that.
Except that because it's such a lopsided, stupid arrangement, what person would ever sign up for that? And I did for a while, so I was an idiot. And then I realized, why am I going to meetings giving them my intellectual property, and they keep it? And then if I want to use it, I got to buy it back from them?
Yeah.
So that's a ridiculous thing. So who does it appeal to? And this is where the conflict comes in. It appeals only to people who can then profit from that arrangement later, and that's what you said, by using it as a credential. Right, and there's only two types of people. One is registrar representatives, because then they can, like BSI, can go on and say, well, we helped write the standard, so you need to get your certificate from us because we helped write the standard.
Right.
And the biggest one is consultants. Consultants use this. I do it myself. I tell people I was on the US tagged PC 176 for 30 minutes, and and that was fun. And then consultants. And so as a result, the majority of the people at these meetings are consultants and registrars, and thus the conflict. So now, it is in their benefit to make the standard as confusing as possible so that you have to buy the services from them to decipher it.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And if you go back to 87, the 1987 version was only 9 pages long.
Yeah.
You didn't need a consultant.
Oh,
it
wow.
was elegant. And it was based on a document, MilQ 9858, which came from the 1950s. which is 40, 50 years ago. I can't do my math. But a long time ago. Right? So that standard was fine for decade after decade after decade, and then ISO adopted it, and it worked fine, and then in 2000, the document started getting bigger, and now it's even bigger. And it's 40 pages, I think, PDF.
Well, that's what I keep saying. We're actually in the middle of a mini-series right now, although I don't know when you're going to release this, so I don't know when they're going to hear it, about understanding the standard. Because every episode we do, I talk about how it's just so big. It feels so big to me, to somebody that doesn't know anything about it. And I can imagine some poor guy that got hired for something else and said, oh, by the way, now you're the quality manager. Read this and figure this out.
That never happens, does it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there's another little secret that ISO doesn't want people to know about, but it's also something you can check. ISO has a pricing model based on page count, right? If you sell a book, it's a skinny little book, I'm only going to sell that for $25. Okay, if I sell a big thick book, I'm going to sell that for maybe $100. So ISO's, because they're a book publisher, they have a book pricing model based on number of pages for a printed copy. So their price point, the price goes up at, I think it's 40 pages. So they had a goal to make ISO 9000 40 pages in order to justify, I think it's $160 or $180.
It's like $180.
The next step up.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Versus if they had kept it at 9 pages like they had in 87, it would only be, I think, worth $25, $30.
And that's a significant difference.
There's actually, if you get the PDF, there's actually a blank page inside the PDF. Right?
Oh, wow.
Not the PDF, I'm sorry, you get the printed version, there's a blank page.
Just so
and
they
you're wondering,
can.
like, why that's it? It's there because they needed to justify to their accountants and everything, why is that price point? So this is why, and this has a practical effect. The clause 8.4, which in the previous standard was 7.4, was called purchasing, right? And the old standard was called purchasing. It's now called control of externally provided processes, services, and products, or something. It's 8 words.
Yeah.
So we took 1 word and replaced it with 8.
Right.
We used to use the word record. We now use retain documented information, which is 3 words.
Yeah.
We used to use the word procedure. Now it's maintain documented. We use 3.
Right.
Because every
This
time
is
they
all
say
a way
that,
to-
it
yeah, you
stretches
slow
it
down.
out.
And that's why you have, and in fact, there's a section on risk-based thinking in the front matter, and then in the annex in the back. It's basically a duplicate.
It
Why?
is.
It's all to pad the page count
Gotcha.
to justify the cover price, and they can make more money.
And see, that's one that's actually confused me because I'm going through it and like, this is like 50% the exact same material, like
exactly.
almost verbatim.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, what's the difference? What are they trying to convey differently? But that makes sense.
Yeah.
They're not trying to convey anything different.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense.
And then we did see too, and I won't mention any names, but they know who they are. But we saw in the U.S. committee that writes the standard, they had at one of their official regular TAG meetings, is the Technical Advisory Group, the TAG. They had at their meeting, they gave a presentation and they put a slideshow, PowerPoint slideshow, which projected on there, and they had a slide that says, risk-based thinking is the biggest boon to consultants ever. And then I got the slideshow, so I published the slideshow. I didn't make the slideshow, it's their slides. They published it, it's got their name on it, it's got the lady's name on it who wrote it,
Right.
and she just put it up on the screen, brazen as anything. That risk-based thinking is the biggest boon for consultants. So I'm not making this stuff up.
Wow.
They just are shameless about it. They don't care if you know that. And
Well-
of course, nobody understands risk-based thinking, so you got to hire her to decipher.
Yeah, and that is probably it's simultaneously one of my favorite and least favorite parts of the standard because I like that it's putting the I can't think of the word, but like requirement and to really consider risk in what you're doing, whereas before the best we really had was maybe preventative actions and those kind of an after the thought type thing. So I like that we're really requiring people to think about it ahead of time, but the way that it is worded and integrated into the system is not good. It's terrible.
Whole section, those clauses were not written by any quality professional. Were not written by the ISO 9000 authoring group. They were written by a group called the ISO TMB, Technical Management Board. The TMB, which is just a group that manages, it's like a bunch of bureaucrats within ISO. Their job is not to write standards, but they wrote that clause and they handed that to the committee and they said, put it in there. And then the committee was forced to put it in there. And then when the voting went around, you were disallowed from voting on that clause. You could not vote on that clause.
Really?
Yeah. So what people did, or not vote, but comment on it. So all the comments related to, we think risk-based thinking clause 6.1 is confusing, they were automatically deleted because the technical committee cannot they cannot override the TMB that wrote it. And the same with clause 4.1 and 4.2, all the context of the organization stuff was not written by a quality management professional.
Well, those are the two truly confusing points. Everything else is a lot more verbose than it was before, but it's nothing terribly confusing about the new edition, except maybe part of how they talk about nonconformities versus corrective actions. That gets a little muddled, but
why can't they be voted on or out?
So the technical committee, let me back up. The TMB, their job is to manage the technical committee. So the structure is you have the ISO executive at top, the CEO
higher.
and their guys, the TMB in the middle, and then you got the technical committees here, and they all write. So we got one that writes 9,000, they got one that 14,000.
Gotcha.
Right? The TMB manages the technical committees, and the job is that so that like if corruption starts to happen in one of these, the TMB can disband the group. So they're there to enforce the rules. Well, now the TMB is writing context to the content, right? And I just literally got an email today from them still defending the practice, but it violates all of ISO's own rules, but they still do it.
Well, I mean, it's easy to see how that's a conflict.
Well, and
I mean,
it's not their job.
Yeah.
Right?
It's not their job, and we don't even know who's on the TMB. But the text that TMB write goes in all the ISO standards. So the same text winds up in the 14,000 for environmental, and it winds up in 9,000, and it winds into medical device, all these other ones, right? Well, so that means that the person writing that is an expert in all these disciplines? No, they don't have to be an expert in anything, and we don't even know who they are.
Wow.
So let me ask you this. Isn't there a requirement in the standard to have an organizational chart?
Not really.
No, okay, I thought there was.
You're required to define roles and responsibilities.
Okay, that's what it is.
To do that, I don't think it's a great one because all an organizational chart does is show reporting structure, who I snitch to. But it's part of that.
Yeah.
And most companies do that to meet at least 50% of that requirement.
Right, so you said they're not following, I mean, if the standard requires showing roles and responsibilities and they're not following their own roles and responsibilities, they're not following their own standards that they're publishing.
ISO does not follow its own standards.
Okay.
In fact, even worse than that, they're held to another set of rules published by the World Trade Organization, the WTO. The WTO has published a huge document called TBT, Technical Barriers to Trade, and there's a whole section that is aimed right at ISO. It says, ISO, when you write standards, you have to write it this way, otherwise you're considered a barrier to free trade and you could be penalized. Well, ISO ignores the WTO, and I wrote to the WTO and said, how long is this going on? And the WTO wrote back to me and said, well, to be honest with you, we have no enforcement mechanism. So the entire TBT rules for how ISO is to develop standards is symbolic. It doesn't mean anything.
Wow.
So ISO is violating the World Trade Organization and should be financially sanctioned, right? But there's no way to do that because the WTO can only sanction countries, not publishing companies.
I got you.
Now, if a country got on board, they could probably launch it.
Right.
I go to the United States, and all the people involved are the consultants that are making money on this, so they're not going to do it. So I'm counting on Venezuela. My good friends in the Maduro regime.
That's hilarious.
I don't know what. In which case, we're in big trouble.
Oh man.
Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. 'Cause a couple things, like I never really understood what the relationship between ANSI and ISO was.
Yeah, ANSI pays ISO to be a member of ISO.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I recently just sent a link to one of my clients who about to start doing a kind of ground up consultation work with, and they need to get a copy of the standard, and so I sent them the ANSI link, if for no other reason than that had US dollars on it.
I think actually ANSI is a little bit cheaper.
I think they were. I think they were like 160 something. Yeah. But
if you want to save a lot of money, buy the AS9100 standard, which is like $80, and it includes the full text of ISO. I don't understand how they did that. And you just ignore all the aerospace stuff. You just bought it cheap.
That's funny.
Or just use Google and you'll find someone's upload.
That's true too. But I can't recommend that.
Yeah, don't do that.
Yeah.
So then, I guess the question is, how would you recommend they do it? Because I like the idea of consultants or people that are in it helping to write it.
Well, the rules are good if they were enforced. The rule says that no single interest category can dominate, and one of the interest categories is consultants. You're supposed to have a balance of consultants, private companies, user organizations, government agencies, and there's, I think, 7 categories, right? And it has to be an even distribution, equal. They just ignore that rule. and they've ignored it for
And that's
decades.
their own rule
That's
again?
their own rule, and they
Okay.
just don't enforce it. In the United States, the committee is overrun by consultants,
Right.
and the consultants actually fib. They actually lie. They say, we have a couple of the consultants, one of whom lives probably 5 feet from here, who he claims he's retired, so he's listed as an individual, but he's probably the most famous ISO consultant in the world. He's a consultant. Right, he's been retired more years than I've been a consultant. He just claims to be retired when it suits his purposes, and
Gotcha.
and the rest of the time doesn't. So, the body that's responsible for managing that honesty and making sure is ASQ. ASQ has the role of being sort of
Really?
the administrative secretary of the standards body in the United States. And ASQ wrote back to me and said, "Yeah, we just trust what people put on the paper. We don't actually enforce it."
Wow.
So
Oh
it's
my
like no
God.
one is following the
Nobody
rules.
cares.
Wow.
So the rules are good. We just need to get them enforced. And I
Well,
think
you know, I
That's so
talked about this
interesting.
during every podcast. My own definition of quality is just simply document what you're going to do and then do it repeatedly.
yeah,
And it
Hopefully the
seems like a
customer's
total
happy.
failure there.
yeah.
Wow.
So they're just not doing
But when you
And it's
understand it's a
fascinating.
publishing company, everything starts to make sense.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
just writing books.
Yeah.
They don't care what's in the book. They just
Yeah.
want the book to be big and thick, and so they can charge a lot of money for it. But they're a little bit frustrated because, as I understand, the sales of ISO 9000 are down because people are really not happy with it. So
Yeah.
ISO's trying to scramble what to do. That's why they're triggering a new revision to Annex L, which will mean a new trigger to a new update to the risk-based
Oh,
thinking
yeah,
clause, and we don't know what's going to happen there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, that's one of the things I just struggle the most with when I do consulting is because it's like, well, you know, maybe we want to do a risk register. Maybe we want to track risk, you know, when we're making a sell. Maybe we want to track risk at the, you know, step level in the work instruction. Like, where is the acceptable point to do it?
Yeah.
And the truth is it's really almost anything that's acceptable as long as you can prove that you tracked it where it matters most. But, you know, kind of the point you made earlier is, and Darcy said as well, is like for a guy that just came off the floor and got thrown in as quality manager, oh, that's a hell of
Yeah.
a task.
Yeah.
It is.
Interesting.
All right. Well, I think our time is up. That
think
gives
so.
our listeners a lot to think about.
No, that's very
And
interesting
ponder
material.
on.
I appreciate it. Very,
Yeah.
very good.
Cool. Okay.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
All right,
Thanks
thanks.
a lot.